Across 5 Aprils by Irene Hunt. Chapter 1. Ellen Creighton and her 9-year-old son, Jethro, were planting potatoes in a half-acre just south of their cabin that morning in mid-April 1861. They were out in the field as soon as breakfast was over in southern Illinois. At the hour was pink with sunrise, and swelling redbud and clusters of bloom over the apple orchard across the road. Jethro walked on the warm clods of plowed earth and felt them crumble beneath his feet as he helped his mother carry the tub of potato cuttings they had prepared the night before. "It's damp fur down and warm on top," he remarked, poking a brown hand deep into the soil. "Once we get these planted and a soft rain comes, we'll heave a crop to make people go north, call us Egypt for sure." He filled up a burlap pouch with the potato cuttings and hoisted it up expertly to his thin shoulder, where a batch of new freckles was just beginning to appear. The world seemed a good place to him that morning, and he felt ready to stride down the length of the field with a firm step and a joke on his lips. "Do you reckon we'll be through by the time ham and cornbread is ready for dinner, Miss Cretin?" he asked, grinning. He called her Miss Cretin because, as his older brothers did when they teased her, it was just a step from the too bold joke of addressing her by her given name. His mother smiled back at him, acknowledging his mood, but she shook her head at his words. "Your hopes is making a fool of your reason, Jeff. We're lucky if those taters is bedded by noon tomorrow." She made short, quick cuts with her hoe in the marrow soil and waited until Jethro placed a cutting eye upward in the spot hollowed out for it, after which she raked a covering of soil over it and moved down the long furrow. She was a small, spare woman with large, dark eyes and skin as brown and dry as leather. She'd been a pretty girl back in the 1830s when she married Matthew Creighton, but prettiness was short-lived among country women of her time. She didn't think much about it anymore, except now when Jenny's 14-year-old radiance was especially compelling. Even if she had been concerned, there had been reverberations of Calvinism strong within her, which would have protested vigorously against the vanity of regret for a passing beauty. She had borne 12 children. 4 of them were dead, perhaps 5, for the oldest son had not been heard from since he left the gold fields of California 12 years before. She had lived through sickness, poverty, and danger for over 30 years. The sight of a pretty face might bring a tired smile to her lips, but it was a thing of little value in Ellen's world. Jethro was the youngest child, born in the year of 52, a year in which 3 of her children died within 1 week of the dreaded disease they called paralysis, a disease that struck the country that year, people said, like the soldiers of Harold. Ellen knew that she favored her youngest son, that she overlooked shortcomings in Jethro for which her older children had been punished. It was a weakness of her advancing years, she supposed, but this was the son who had been spared that summer when children all around were dying of the agonizing sickness. It looked as if somehow destiny had marked him. One didn't talk about such things. The world, she knew, was impatient with women who value their children too highly. Ellen kept her silence, but she saw signs of special talents in Jethro, and she watched over him with special tenderness. They walked together for an hour or more without speaking. Ellen was grave and absorbed in the anxious thoughts of that spring. Jethro was accustomed to adapting himself to the behaviors and moods of older people, and he found enough in the world about him to occupy the interest as he worked. A south breeze brought the scent of lilacs and sweet fennel to his nostrils and set all the frosty green leaves of silver popple trees to trembling. There was a column of wood smoke feathering up from the kitchen chimney, a sign that Jenny was already making preparations for a hearty noon meal. From the neighboring fields across the creek, he could hear the shouted commands to the plow horses as Matt Creighton and his 2 older sons got on with the spring plowing. It was a fine morning. Many people around him were troubled. He knew, but that was a part of the adult world, which he accepted as a matter of course. Adults were usually troubled. There were They were cinch bugs and grasshoppers, months of drought, elections, slavery, secession, talks of war, the adult world of trouble, though it was not real enough to dim the goodness of an April morning. At about 7 o'clock, a team and a wagon pulled out of the barn lot, stopping for a minute before turning into the road while the driver spoke to a girl who came running out of the kitchen door. Jethro chuckled. She's leaving for Newton now, I guess. Jenny was say goodbye, as if he's going to the North Pole. He watched the wagon from the corner of his eye as he worked, and when the team started coming down the road toward the potato patch, he put the heavy bag of cuttings aside and raced across the field to the roadside. His mother laid down her hoe and followed slowly, picking her way over the mounds of plowed earth that Jethro's feet seemed barely to touch. The young schoolmaster stopped the team and climbed down from the wagon to stand at the fence row, waiting for Jethro and Ellen to come up from the midfield. He was a tall, powerful-built youth of 20, with a firm mouth and grave, dark eyes that gave him the appearance of an older man. He had come from Pennsylvania 3 years earlier to study at McKendree College, where an uncle was professor of the natural philosophy, a subject that later generations would call physics. Faced with insufficient funds to carry out his studies at the end of his first year, young Yale had turned to the country schools as a stepping stone towards further work in college, and a series of circumstances had led him to the school in which Matt Creighton served as a director. Here he had stayed, not just 1 year, as originally planned, but 2, and now in 1861 he had hired himself out as a farmhand to Matt for the summer and contracted to teach still a third term that fall. He'd been stricken with typhoid fever during the first year of teaching, and Ellen Creighton had patiently nursed him back to health with the skill he had learned over the years. There was a strong tie of affection between the two of them. Ellen counted Shadrach as a part of her family and looked after him as she did her own. And Shadrach, Yale, in turn, showed a thoughtful courtesy of her a few women of the prairies received from their own sons. "Will you be back by supper time, Shad?" Jethro called breathlessly as he approached the fence row. At school he had addressed the young teacher as master, but now that Shadrach was so much a member of the family, then the necessary formalities of schoolroom were forgotten. "It's not likely, Jeth. Not before 9 or maybe later." Shadrach smiled at the thin, eager face turned up to him. He was mature enough at 20 to appreciate being a hero to a 9-year-old boy. Besides that, Jethro's quick mind and delight in learning had been a source of pleasure for studious young Yale, who had been known the frustration of trying to penetrate the apathy and unconcern of backwoods classrooms. He had talked to both parents about the promise he recognized in the boy. Matt, in spite of his pleasure, had shaken his head and wondered if the praise of Jethro had not stemmed from interest in Jethro's sister, Jenny. But Ellen, who had felt no doubts, the praise was in line with that she herself believed firmly. She stood beside the gray rails that morning with her hands folded beneath her apron. Matt had made a pretext of needing supplies from town, and she knew that this trip to Newton in the midst of a late planting season would have been unthinkable except for the urgency of getting word from the world beyond their own fields and wood pastures. Her face looked drawn in the bright sunlight. "I wish there was a telegraph in Newton, Shad," she said. He nodded. "There's one in Olney. They'll send any important news on up to Newton as soon as it comes through. At any rate, I'll bring the latest papers. Seems sometimes there's a deep silence all about us out here waiting to be filled." She said. The young man looked at one another, each pair of eyes dark with anxiety. Jethro kicked a stone in the road. "Sure wishing I was going to town with you, Shad," he said firmly, "because it seemed that someone must say something." "I know. Well, there'll be other trips this summer, Jeth." Shadrach started to climb back into the wagon as he spoke. Then, changing his mind, he turned back and placed his hands quickly on Ellen's shoulders. "Try not to worry," he said quietly. The caress brought sudden tears to her eyes. She and Jethro stood watching as he drove away. When the wagon disappeared in a clump of trees at a bend in the road, Ellen turned back to her work slowly, as if overwhelmed by a deep weariness. The Lord knows what news he'll bring back, she said. There may be war in the land, at this minute, for all we know. Jethro was depressed by her somber mood, but not by the imminence of war. He had listened to his brother Tom and her cousins Eb, the two younger of the grown-up boys in the household, and their excitement had found its way into his blood. Dread of war was a womanly weakness, he had discovered, evidenced by his mother's melancholy and the tears of Jenny and his brother John's wife Nancy. I heard some of the big fellers talking the other night that they said the war, even if it comes, will be no more than a breakfast spell. They said that soldiers up here can take the South by the britches and make it holler, not quicker than it takes coffee to cool off her swallowing. Jethro spoke hurriedly, almost sure that the words would anger his mother and vaguely realizing that he wanted to anger her a little for spoiling the brightness of the morning by her obvious sadness. She had a way of closing her eyes briefly, was exasperated, as if to reject for this, at least a second the existence of a folly that she would be bound to recognize later. Her hoe jabbed deeper and more sharply into the brown earth at her feet. They're foolishly young uns. They're talking without a spark of reason to guide their words, she said angrily. It ain't that I don't love 'em, big talk or not, she added, but I'm fearful of the day when they face the competence. I'm fearful of the time when I'll have no boys left but you, the three little ones up on the Walnut Hill. Jethro squirmed inwardly. If there were going to be tears and talk of the children who had died this summer, he was born. He wanted to escape. And since one didn't easily escape from his mother in the midst of planting a half acre of potatoes, he searched hurriedly for a way to turn the conversation. Did I ever tell you, Ma, of an old feller that gave all the people of the earth their compulence? He asked brightly, knowing that she was always proud to hear the things he learned from Shadrach at school. I reckon you didn't, Jeff. Not that I am able to recollect. Jethro straightened his shoulders a little under the weight upon them. Well, ma'am, there was a long time when people allowed that the earth was the big kingpin amongst all the stars and things. They thought that the moon and the sun and all the stars went round the earth, maybe kind of tipped their hats as well as they went by. Shad says that most everybody went on believing that for years, until finally they came along this man I'm telling you about. He was head and shoulders smarter than the run-of-the-mill. And after he'd watched the sun and moon and stars for a long time, he sat down and he done some figuring. Well, when he got through figuring, he showed it to some other fellers, and there was plain as anything. The earth wasn't the big kingpin at all. He allowed it to just a little old star chasing around the sun, with a pack of others, some of them a lot bigger than us. Shad says that some folks took the news real hard. It kind of let the wind out of their sails all of a sudden. That ain't in the scriptures, is it, Jeff? I don't reckon so, but it's in one of the books Shad brought us from Philadelphia. His mother looked thoughtful. The Lord God created the earth and all upon it, Jeff. I don't like to hear that his work weren't of the best. But don't you see, Ma? He created the sun and the moon and the stars, too. Some a little bigger, others maybe a little prettier. Seems like people on earth believed we had the best diggings just because we wanted to believe that, because it made us feel important. You ain't watching to keep that tater eyes facing up, Jeff, Ellen said quietly, pointing to the tip of her hoe. He stooped and turned a cutting over. Guess I kind of got carried away with my own noise, he said, flushing. Her eyes lighted a little. Well, you done me a favor, telling me things I ain't never learned and giving me something to ponder over. It amazes me, Jeff. It does for a fact, the way you can recollect all the things Shad tells you and how you can put them from his way of talking into mine. She hoed in silence for a minute and then paid him the great compliment of going back to his story. Did you tell me that the old feller's name was? The one that I'm done all the figuring? His name was Cornelius. I could even spell it for you, if you're mind. Shad made me learn how to say it and spell it too. Sounds like Furniture. Jethro nodded. I allow, he agreed. Ellen sighed. Seems like Furniner's is alias stirring up something. Well, the pot can't call the kettle black. Look, we're stirring up amongst ourselves. She was back to the problems of the times, and Jethro knew that she could not tempt her away from them. For months he had moved along the edge of the furor that raged among the adults of his family, and the neighborhood, and even the church. He knew that there had been fights in the neighborhood, anger and triumph over the election of the President Lincoln in the fall of '60. But he supposed, if he thought of it all, that this was the natural behavior of people interested in the vague thing called politics. He had heard talk of tariffs, of slave states and free ones, of a violent old man named John Brown, and during the past winter, states seceding from the Union. But it had just been taught to him, and the only part of all the talk was held any interest to him was a conviction among all men that were sure to break out sooner or later. It hadn't broken out yet, however, and some men were swearing because the president had not declared war, while others were saying, just be old Abe fire on the South and watch Kentucky, Missouri, Tennessee, yes, and maybe southern Illinois tumble over on the Confederate side of the fence. He knew a little about wars, the Revolution, of course, the American Revolution. Shadrach had pointed out, and Jethro had been amazed that there was ever any other. He liked stories of wars. There was a beautiful one described in one of Shad's books in which an ancient king watched ships fight in a place called Salamis Bay. There was also another exciting story of a battle in which small, fast ships, with the lucky help of a violent storm, had played Old Ned with a proud and mighty navy. He wanted to tell his mother about that one, but if the battle had gone the other way, both Ellen and Jethro Creighton might well have been speaking Spanish as they planted their potatoes that April morning. She wouldn't have liked that, though. She was suspicious of people who spoke a different language. Well, one learned when to speak and when to keep one's tongue between his teeth. Jethro was not going to talk to his mother too much of either languages of war, but he knew that, as far as the latter were concerned, he was the one with young Tom and Eb when they hoped that the war would come soon. War meant loud brass music and shiny horses ridden by the men wearing uniforms finer than any suit in the stores at Newton. It meant that men riding like kings, looking neither to the right nor left, while lesser men in perfect line strode along with guns across their shoulders, their heads held high like horses with short reins. When the battle thundered and exploded on all sides, while some men were killed, of course, but the stories of war that Jethro remembered were about the men who had managed to live through the thunder and explosion. Matt Creighton's grandfather had lived through the Revolution. Matt himself had survived the Mexican War, and Uncle Billy Jeffers down the road was still alive to tell the tales of War of 1812. Jethro, forgetting the lecture to his mother of the incineration of people to select beliefs that bring them most satisfaction, never doubted that if Tom and Eb got their chance to go to war, they'd be back home when it was over. And that would be shadowy men from distant parts who would die for pages of future history books. Death, however, was neither simple nor lightly brushed aside when it struck home. Jethro frowned. He didn't like to think of his sister Mary's death, but some memory had been touched off of it as his thoughts wandered. Yet a few hours of work go by and let one's body begin to weary a little. Then the thoughts that had been all the beauty in the spring while before turning out to things that were all better forgotten. He'd not forgotten, though. He'd been only 7 that winter of '59, but the memory of the tragedy would always be sharp and terrible in his mind. Mary had been as pretty as Jenny, only blonde and more delicate. Jethro remembered that it was a bitter night and that he had stood with his nose pressed against the cold windowpane watching Rob Nelson help her into the wagon before they left for a dance toward Hidalgo. What happened later he pieced together from a loud outcries and scraps of conversation deep in the middle of the night. It seemed that a crowd of young toughs from the south of the country had broken uninvited into the dance, waving whiskey bottles and shouting drunken insults at the guests. As things began to look more and more dangerous, Rob found Mary's wraps, and they were starting for home when a drunken youth named Travis Burdo saw them leave and followed them on horseback. Rob told Matt Creighton how he had urged the team, hoping to get to Ed Turner's farm where he could get help, because he knew that Burdow was armed. Rob had succeeded in getting as far as Turner's driveway when Burdow, seeing that his game was about finished, rode up beside Rob's team and fired a pistol over the heads of the horses. The frightened animals bolted through a rail fence, overturning the wagon and kicking themselves loose from the tongue. Mary was dead when Rob and Ed Turner pulled her from the wreckage. The countryside was in an uproar the next day when news of tragedy got around. Matthew Creighton was held in high esteem by his neighbors, and his senseless killing of his daughter stirred up a rage that was heightened by the fact that the whole Burdow family was commonly despised throughout the countryside as a shiftless lot with a bad background. The grandfather of Travis Burdow had come from somewhere farther downstate, and when he moved into Jasper County, he came hurriedly in order, so that the story went, to escape a mob of citizens whose anger during the years of petty thieving had exploded over theft of a team of horses from a prosperous farmer. Whether the story was true or not, suspicion or dislike settled upon the family, and 30 years had failed to dissipate it. The Burdow children were nicknamed Jail Burdows by taunting schoolmates and persecuted in 100 petty ways. Dave Burdow, father of young Travis and son of the alleged horse thief, was sullen, silent man who shunned people in general and accepted their insults as a matter of course when he was forced to deal with them. His sons, for the most part, were much like him, except when liquor quickened their courage and defiance. The shot that Travis Burdow shot over Rob Nelson's team that night was a shot fired at society that had kicked a boy from childhood on because he bore his grandfather's name. And so the anger of the mob at Mary's death was doubled and tripled because Burdow was responsible. By late afternoon, a crowd of 50 or more armed men stopped at the Creighton cabin to tell Matt of their intention of hunting Travis Burdow down and hanging him on the spot. But Matt Creighton had intervened, and it was a mark of the respect he commanded to the community that the men listened as he stood for an hour in the icy afternoon pleading with them to keep their hands free of further bloodshed. Jethro, understanding the situation more fully now that he was older, wondered at his father's intervention that afternoon. His own sympathies, even on the spring morning 18 months later, were with the angry men as they prepared for the manhunt. He wondered. He had a great confidence in his father, but his sense of justice had hard put accept the fact that Travis Burdow had been allowed to escape the consequences of his drunken crime. It occurred to him, as he felt the same way towards his father as he did toward Abraham Lincoln, why should the president waver so long? Why should he refuse, week after week, to start the great explosion which young men wanted to get started and have finished before the years, as well into the summer? Jethro had to admit to himself an uncomfortable feeling of anger for both the president and his father. They had not shown the hard, unyielding attitude he admired in the talk of Tom and Eb and their friends. He sighed suddenly and deeply at his perplexities. Ellen noticed the sigh and glanced at him quickly. "Be you spent, Jethro?" He shook his head. "No, I'm doing tolerable. I was just thinking about things." "What kind of things, son?" "For one thing, I was wondering why Abraham Lincoln can't make up his mind about war. I wonder if he's like Pa. Is he against having blood on people's hands that he's afraid to start a war?" Ellen stopped her work and stood for a moment without speaking, her rough brown hands resting in the middle of the hoe. "He's like a man standing where two roads meet, Jeff," she said finally. "And one road is as dark and fearsome as the other. There ain't a choice between the two, and yet a choice has to be made." She shook her head. "May the Lord help him," she whispered. "May the Lord guide his hand." The sounds of morning were all around them as they stood silently in the middle of the furrow. From the fields across the creek, across the monotonous shout of the field horses, up to the house of Jenny's voice came clearly, pleasant as the sound of the little bell ringing. "Here, Chick," she called. "Here, Chick, 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 Chick." Ellen slowly reached out with her hoe and broke a clod of dirt into crumbling fragments. "Well, we got planting to do, Jeff," she said at at last, and they went on with their work. When the sun was directly above their heads, Ellen leaned against the fence, and she and the boy trudged slowly up along the fence road toward the house. Hunger pangs twisted Jethro's inside, and he was tired. About the prospect of dinner and an hour of cool rest under the trees in the dooryard cheered him to the point where he could whistle a little and make lazy gestures of play with the shepherd dog, and came bounding down the path to greet him. The cabin they approached was small and squat, built of logs and with entirely plain. The typical pioneer cabin. Its basic ugliness was softened by a thick growth of vines clambering over the walls and roof, by a general air of neatness and the pleasant dignity in the dooryard. The hedgerow of lilacs and the prim green rows of vegetables in the garden. 2 rows of the cabin faced west, both opening onto an uncovered porch where a half-dozen split-bottom chairs were arranged for the comfort of those who wished to rest and get a breath of air after meals, or to sit in the coolness of the spring night and watch shadows move in over the prairies. Behind these rooms, a kitchen extended the width of the house, the doors at either end opening onto the dooryard. Here, huge silver popples towered above the cabin, their roots extending like giant claws, making the ground rough and robbing of it grass. A low picket fence, covered with tangled sweet honeysuckle, stretched along the front of the yard. Beyond the fence was a hitching post in an area covered by the sweet clover of an acid-smelling little flower that Jethro knew as dog fennel. The road in front of the house ran due north through that line where the last glacier had melted in some distant age and left its final load of drift, a line that separated the rich, black loam culture of northern Illinois from the poor, hard-packed clay culture to the south. Jethro regretted the melting of the glacier. If it could have hung on another 100 miles, life might have been very different for him and his family. But then it hadn't. And anyway, he loved the dog fennel and silver popples and the hedge of lilacs on the south that separated Jenny's well-drained kitchen garden from the dooryard. He doubted that there were such wooded hills or winding creeks in the corn belt of the north as one could find by the dozens in the clay lands, but he could not imagine contentment in any other spot other than this one, which his father had chosen 30 years before. But it was pitied about the glacier. Only another 100 miles. Jenny had poured fresh water into a big basin so that her mother and Jethro could cool their faces and wash the dirt and grime from their hands. Nancy and their little tykes were here. She called to Ellen, "We got a nice meal fixed for you." Jenny had swept their shiny black hair high upon her head because the heat in the kitchen where the food was prepared over an open fireplace, and the little drops of sweat stood out under her eyes and over a very firm chin. She grinned at Jethro and whacked him briskly on the seat as he came up to the kitchen as well. "I've got a crock of lettuce for you, Jeff, though I'm terrible wasting and picking it too young. But I know how you've been dreaming green things as far back as last December. Nancy and I allowed maybe your body had need of spring eating. Green food." The hunger pangs grew even sharper at her words. His body did, indeed, have need of green food of a continuous hunger, for it meant that a need existed. He had felt many times during the long winter that he would have gladly exchanged all the pork in the smokehouse and all the gallons of smogum which he had helped to boil down for one big crock of salad greens. He smiled at her, and Jenny understood his gratitude. It was as much as she expected. The Creighton males did not go into long speeches about such matters. John's wife looked up from her work and smiled shyly at Jethro and her mother-in-law when they entered the kitchen. "I invited myself up for the day, Miss Creighton," she said in her thin voice. The name Miss Creighton was not a joke when Nancy used it. There was a reserve about the thin, quiet girl John had brought back from Kansas 4 years before that kept her almost a stranger in her husband's family. She was admirable, but aloof to the friendly Creightons. except for an occasional gesture of fondness for Jenny and for John's favorite brother Bill. John defended his wife earnestly to his mother. She was brought up by relations that treated her harsh. To draw back and say nothing is her way of protecting herself. You must be patient with her, Ma, like one of your own. Ellen had long schooling in patience. Now, as she answered Nancy's greeting, her voice was very quiet. You never need every invitation to John's home, Nancy. It's yours, too. You're here welcome any day. She seated herself beside the door and took the youngest child in her lap. Nancy went on with her work, not sullenly, but so withdrawn that Ellen wearily gave up trying to talk with her and directed all her attention to the small boy. The men came in from the fields soon. Jethro, because he was now a field worker, was allowed to eat at the first table with his parents and elder brothers. It was a coveted honor, and he accepted it with dignity, looking somewhat like a solemn dwarf as he sat between his father and Bill, his eyes wide beneath the tumble of yellow curls that clung to his forehead and the back of his neck. Across from him were the 18-year-olds. Tom was a mild-faced lad who, like Jethro and Bill, had inherited the blond hair and blue eyes of his father's side of the family. Eb Carrion, a nephew of Matt's, had lived with the Creightons since he had been orphaned in childhood. Jethro admired the two big boys, but he sensed their indifference toward him and kept his distance generally. He was not especially hurt by their attitude. The youngest in the family knew his place. Besides, Jenny and Bill made up for any neglect on the part of the big boys 100 times or more. Bill, his favorite, was a big, silent man who was considered particular in the neighborhood. In an environment where reading was not regarded highly, there was something suspect about a young man who not only cared very little of hunting or wrestling and nothing at all for drinking and rampaging about the country, but who read every book he could lay his hands upon as if prized a printed page more than the people around him. He wasn't quite held in contempt, for he had great physical strength and was a hard worker, two attributes admired by the people around him. But he was odd. There was no doubt of that. Men who had seen him stop his team in midfield to watch the flight of a line of birds, and the story went the rounds of Bill talking to his horse as if they were a person. He talked to it gentle, the story went, like a woman talking to a young one. He had even attended school for the previous winter when work was slack, which was surely a fool thing to do unless one was interested in breaking up school. He had listened intently to what the young man 3 years his junior had to say. He had studied and done his task set for him by Shad, Yale, as if there were no older than Jethro. It was not a behavior pattern of which the backwoods community approved. A lot of people smirked a little when they mentioned Bill Creighton. Jethro loved Bill far and away beyond his other brothers. His mother understood why. He put his hand in the fire for you, Jeth, she told him once, and Jethro believed her. John, the oldest of the children left at the home place, sat at the end of the table facing his mother. He was dark like Ellen and more slender and wearily than Bill. These two brothers were very close to one another, a fact which had always been a matter of pride to Ellen, who strove to make family ties firm and secure. John was more impatient, quicker to anger than Bill, but the two of them had sought each other's companionship from childhood. There seemed to be a bond of understanding between them and had developed with the years. John's oldest son was named for his brother, and Nancy, whose aloofness toward Ellen and Matt never once gave away, in defense of all their efforts, addressed John's favorite as Brother Bill. Jethro neither liked nor disliked John, perhaps because of Nancy's shyness, which he interpreted as unfriendliness. The boy extended his feelings of uneasiness with her to John and the two children. He seldom went near his brother's cabin, which was only a half-mile away, and he had no move to attract or amuse the children. Jenny moved quickly and a little breathlessly from the fireplace to the table, carrying dishes of meat and roasted potatoes, pitchers of milk, and great mounds of cornbread squares, still powdered with the wood ashes in which they had been baked. She was red-cheeked with pride over the efforts that providing a good dinner. Her eyes flashed a little in the direction of Tom and Eb, from whom she anticipated the usual teasing. Jethro smiled at her when she brought on the huge crock of lettuce, and Jenny saw to it that he received a generous serving before she passed it on around the table. Nancy poured steaming coffee into big mugs, and Jenny placed one beside the plate of each adult at the table. Children might have priority to a pudding or the last piece of cake, but coffee was an adult luxury, which Jethro enjoyed, but dismissed with a passive acceptance of family custom that he never thought to question. On this day of the boys' graduation to first table honors, however, Bill took a dried crust of bread, the remains of a rarely served white loaf, and after soaking it in his coffee cup for a few seconds, spread it with butter and placed it on his brother's plate. Jethro nodded his thanks briefly. He did not wish to attract the attention of others at the table to the favor. "This meal is right good, Jenny," John remarked unpleasantly. You air a fair cook for your years. You might have had cake fixin' though, if Shad had been eatin' with us," Tom said, grinning at his sister, who could hardly hold back the pleased smile that mention of the young schoolmaster elicited. "Can't help me feel a bit sorry for Shad," Eb added solemnly. "Jenny's been feeding him so nice lately. He won't be able to say no come a leap year." "Jenny's fur and away too young to be thinking about Shad or any other young man," her father remarked quietly. Jenny looked at the ceiling for an exasperated second as she stood behind her father's chair. She was only 14, it was true, but she was as tall as Nancy and within 2 years old as Ellen, who'd been when she married Matthew Creighton. It was also true that she had her eye on Shadrach Yale, and all had been going well, too, until recently when, after a private talk with her father, the young schoolmaster had taken on a solemn and paternal attitude towards her, which Jenny found intensely annoying and unsatisfactory. Wonder when Shad allows us to get back, John asked after a guarded smile had been shared by the young people. "By 9 or thereabouts," he thought, Ellen answered. "I hope we won't get too fur spent to wait up for him." "I won't," John said. "I want to see them city newspapers." He stopped as he saw Nancy's anxious eyes on his face. He had tried to avoid talk of war as much as possible lately. The 2 younger boys were eager for it. The womenfolk were ready to cry about it, and Bill, for the first time that John could remember, had reservations about his subject and seemed unwilling to discuss it with his brother. They ate in silence after that, but there was a tension in the air. Jethro, although he was concerned mostly with the goodness of the food he ate, was vaguely aware of the troubled preoccupation of all about him. He and his mother went back to the fields after they had rested for an hour or so. The afternoon was hot, and the new freckles across Jethro's shoulders were nearly lost by mid-afternoon beneath the red burn that spread over them. Ellen untied her apron and folded it across the back of his neck. That helped a little until the thongs of the potato pouch rubbed a blister on the sunburned skin, after which sweat and insects joined forces to torment him. The buoyancy of spirit and the beauty of early morning had long since given way to discomfort and boredom of monotony. By sundown, both Ellen and Jethro dragged down the length of the field with weariness, lining their faces and tugging at their bodies. "Seems like a lot of taters, Miss Creighton," Jethro said, finally. He tried to smile, but the dark circles around his eyes were more convincing than his smile. At the end of the furrow, Ellen sat down on the grass near the rail fence and reached a hand out to the boy. "We'll set for a minute, Jeff. Sun up to sundown is a long time for either boy or woman. The plantain won't suffer over much if we spell ourselves a little." He was grateful for the rest, and clasping his knees, he let his head fall forward, while comfort poured all through him with the relaxation of his body. He teased an ant that tried to run across a stick at his feet, blocking his way with the big toe of one foot and then the other, chuckling a little at his own mischief. Shadows were beginning to grow long among the trees on Walnut Hill, and down along the creek where dogwood branches stood out whiter and more ghostly clouds with the background of misty purple thickening behind him. Jethro let the ant go on its way and sat staring at the shadows with the lonely ache that beauty sometimes brought to him. He turned once to speak to his mother, but she sat silently, her large eyes closed as she rested her head against one of the gray rails. So he said nothing, glad to prolong their rest for as long as possible. They had sat for about 10 minutes or more when the sound of wheels far down the road attracted their attention. Ellen rose stiffly and leaned against the rails. Jethro stood beside her. "It's too early for Shad to be getting back from Newton," Ellen said, rubbing her eyes. "Can you make out whose team it is, Jeth?" "Not anybody from right around here," he answered. "Sure it is fine, high-stepping team, though." They watched curiously as the wagon approached the team, obliviously being checked as the driver saw Ellen and Jethro beside the fence. Then, as the wagon came to the stop beside them, the young man rose from the seat and swept off his hat. "Ain't you folks up here in Illinois a mite behind in your crops this year, Aunt Ellen?" he called, his voice suggesting laughter. Ellen's face broke into a wide smile of recognition. "Well, in the name of all that's good, Will Scram, wherever brings you up from Kentuck at this time of year?" She climbed over the low rails and held out her arms to the young man who had jumped down from the wagon. "I've been some dealings in these parts, Aunt Ellen. I figured it's worth an extra day of driving to see all of you. Think you can put me and my team up for the night?" Jethro could see the pleasure of his mother's face. This cousin Will Scram was her sister's son. His visit had meant news of the Kentucky country where Ellen had been born, and the relatives from whom she seldom heard. As for Jethro, delight ran up his spine. He didn't know Will Scram, but the man was company, and that meant enough to set his day apart from the monotonous routine of many others.